Okay, thank you all for coming today. Let me adjust the mic here. I want to say a few words of thanks following up on what Qudsia has been acknowledging, which is that it takes a village to make something like a biennale happen, and it's been amazing to see the warmth and the energy of the people who have been part of the adventure so far, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you in the months ahead leading up to February. And I think it's been really kind of inspirational to see the degree to which Lahoris have been so kind of warm in extending their hospitality to a foreigner like me, despite the logistical complications presented by Ramzan. And thank you all, shukriya. And especially to the artists and others whom I've had the good fortune to be able to meet and speak with, among them all of you here. And you'll be hearing more about the artists, not today, but in the months to come. And I also would like to thank the Walled City Lahore Authority, which has been such a kind of a wonderful partner so far. And Kamran Lashari, thank you so much for being here. And also to Aisha Khan and to their colleagues. It's been really interesting to explore the city with their help and their aid. Opening the doors, as it were, literally, to places that I certainly had never seen. Maybe that's to be expected, but even places that born Lahoris maybe haven't seen before, and we're looking forward to sharing some of those discoveries and some of those places with you. I would also, following Qudsia, I'd like to thank the LBF team, so Amira Khan, Adil Babar, Ashad Fraz, Arnzaib, Shabaz Anjum, and Zirak Sohail, and Usama, who's somewhere flitting in the, right there. And also to the larger family of LBF, Osman Khalid Wahid, Tariq Zaman, Mohsin Hamid, Rafa Ali Dada, Najish Adaullah, Rafi Alam, and also Naya Ayeli Dada, Saida Nigat Ali, Salima Hashmi, of course, and Iftikhar Dadi. And most of all, to Qudsia, whose dynamism, humor, and positivity have real force, right? And it has been inspiring, and without whom none of this would be possible. So, okay, now that I've given the acknowledgements, maybe it's time to share a little some of the kind of thinking process for the third edition of the Biennale. And I'll just start by saying that, I think as Qudsia outlined, there are very kind of urgent reasons why this particular edition of the Biennale is thinking about questions related to ecology and sustainable futures. And partly because those challenges, ecological challenges, have become such an everyday occurrence everywhere, and especially in the global majority, right, which is being disproportionately affected by ongoing climate crisis. And the ensuing challenges are acute, especially acute in megacities, such as Lahore, right, which in the face of migration and population growth and migration from agricultural regions continue to rapidly expand beyond the capacities of formal urban planning. I think, Lahore is a case in point where the city has literally doubled in size in the last decades and looks to double in size again if the current government has any say about it, right? So these are tall tasks, right? As a result, these cities face severe environmental degradation, poor air quality, lack of water, loss of open and green spaces, not to mention noise and light pollution. The environmental conditions exacerbate other challenges, right? So in other words, they're not just problems in and of themselves, they also link with other problems as well. And so these other challenges that urban communities face, from lack of meaningful educational and employment opportunities, lack of compromised housing and transportation, and basic amenities, right? And all of which have been compounded by the pandemic, of course. So these problems have, of course, reached a tipping point in Pakistan in the past year. And I'm showing you a photograph of the flood from last summer. This is from Sindh. As the catastrophic floods and the subsequent displacement of millions of farmers have aggravated already serious social and ecological problems, showing how rural regions of Pakistan and South Asia also share and face these acute problems, right, like the megacities. So in tackling this topic, the Biennale artists are being invited to address these pressing issues. At the same time, in bringing together artists from around the world, and especially from the global majority to Lahore, the Biennale also underscores that Pakistan is not alone, right, in confronting challenges brought on by a climate crisis, and that it has much in common with other places, and that solidarities exist across national lines. So I want to talk a little about the methodologies that are informing the research and the thinking behind the Biennale, this coming edition. And one of the keywords has to do with sustainability, right? And I think so by now, I think most of us probably have heard sustainability before and think we're familiar with it. And obviously, it implies a certain way of living that does not live beyond one's means, right? Does not exhaust resources that are available. And how does that, you might want to ask, apply to a thing like a Biennale, right? Well, I think it applies in terms of the thinking, right, and the kind of work that will be promoted. And I think to this degree, it's interesting that the Lahore Biennale itself is an exercise in working with what is already there, right? So in other words, the Biennale was not created with a kind of purpose-built, Kunsthalle or exhibition space. It really was about exploring the city and understanding the city and bring the city and art to the people of Lahore, right? So in what is already there. And you can see, from the, is there a laser? Okay, no laser pointer. But you can see the itinerary from the first edition, that the different sites that the Biennale took up, right? And so there's that aspect of the Biennale, Lahore Biennale, which is already thinking about these questions about conservation and preservation, right? And thinking about that aspect of the city and the urban fabric. But I think it's also about, and here you can see one of the kind of more spectacular sites, the Sheesh Mahal, right? Which is part of the walled fort. But I think it's also about thinking about different parts of this, the older city. And here you see two pictures of the walled city. One, which I think is meant to be the narrowest street, right? And another of the rooftop porches, right? And I'm showing you this because I think that, part of what's been so informative and really kind of meaningful in exploring the city has been thinking about the texture of the city itself and how that might be a player or a kind of a take a part in the development of the Biennale. Beyond, I think, simply hosting the artwork or hosting the artists, right, and letting them have their express themselves. I think that there's ways in which the city itself is a kind of an actor in all of this, right? And what do I mean by this? I think I want to kind of illustrate this by thinking with you about these two images of the walled city, because when I saw the walled city, one of the things that struck me was that not necessarily intentionally or deliberately, but over the centuries, the design of the walled city, I think, responded to the natural climate of Lahore, right? So what we're talking about, for instance, is the way that the city is, of course, very dense. The walled city is very dense and closed in, but that closed-inness means something in terms of energy usage, right? In the winter, it's easier to keep warm when buildings are close together. In the summer, the closeness of the buildings provides shade, right? And keeps people from being exposed to the sun more than necessary. And then in the second picture, we can see, the way that these rooftops also served as sleeping places traditionally, right? And so these kinds of features of the walled city are already kind of suggesting that there's a local or an indigenous knowledge, right, which is to be foregrounded and taken into consideration in thinking about how we develop in the present an eco-consciousness, right? And if ecological and urban issues are increasingly global ones, it's this way that, we have to think about the local forms of knowledge and practices and how they can be resources in addressing challenges that face us today and face us in the future, right? And so the heritage, in other words, is part of the dialogue, is going to be part of the conversation, not just a backdrop, but really kind of an active participant, right? And so I want to also share with you, another kind of location that, I've been thinking about, which is the Shalimar Gardens, which is, of course, justly famous as one of the most, revered sites in Lahore, built during the era of Shah Jahan. And I think it's, and I'm standing in front of the Aga Khan Foundation. I don't think I need to explain the significance of the building to all of you here. But I think that, when we think about this building, it's been in terms of design, it's been in terms of architecture, it's been in terms of beauty, it's philosophy, and also the ingenuity of the engineering, right? Because not only is this an amazingly beautiful realization of garden philosophy and the idea of paradise, but it's also something which was designed in a way that, they didn't have this term, but now we could call carbon neutral, right? Because it was functioning through gravity, it was functioning through non-electricity using means, right? And so that in itself is kind of an interesting fact and something that maybe we can kind of think about in terms of what does this mean? How is this a possible resource for thinking about how we design in the future, right? And what we do about the choices we make. But then I think there's an added poignancy when we realize, and this is something which maybe hasn't been so much of the conversation about the Mughal heritage, which is that during the period when this was being constructed in South Asia, there was a centuries-long drought, right? And in fact, in the mid-17th century, that is to say, around the time that the Shalimar Gardens was being built, there was actually it was the period when South Asia saw the weakest period of monsoons on record, right? And so all of this kind of ostentatious display of water and the deployment of water for demonstrating both power, of course, because it's the Mughal Empire, right? But it's also about evoking beauty and evoking kind of the possibility and the promise of joy. That deployment of water at such a moment, I think, is given added significance when we take that into consideration, right? So in other words, the eco-consciousness that this Biennale is seeking to develop is not just about the present, and it's not just about the future. It's also thinking about what can the past show us about eco-consciousness, and how can we work with that, right? How can we as people, how can we as artists and people working with the artists develop that, right? So I think that that's, a demonstration of the kind of thinking that, I'm trying to put into practice through the knowledge, the sharing of knowledge and the sharing of research, but also that the artists themselves are being invited to participate in and to think through and think with, right? And this is not just unique to Lahore. I think, and I am showing you these two images of from the Baburnama, where you can see the kind of the design of the garden, right? But also the water contraptions, right? The engineering that allows for the flow of water. And I also wanted to point out that this consciousness is not something that's unique to the Mughals, right? But also I think that there are ways of thinking about earlier artists, such as Meno Abedin on the right, and then Sadiq Khan on the left, the cactus and picture of the famine, right? How artists have been thinking about human relationship to nature all along. And it's up to us to understand the messages that they've been thinking and sending about that, right? But it's also, Lahore is not alone, in other words. It also has its heritage and its history for thinking about these questions and challenges, but it also is not alone in terms of what is happening around the world, right? And I'm showing you the kind of the index, the 2022 index of the World Risk Index, which is about kind of the susceptibility and vulnerability of different places, countries to catastrophes, right? And you can see that South Asia is up there. Pakistan is actually number 10 on this list. But Southeast Asia, Philippines, and Indonesia are right up there at the top as well, right? And so I think there's questions, these issues are something that is not just affecting South Asia, Pakistan, but also affecting other parts of Asia, other parts of the world. And I think that what we can do with this edition of the Biennale is use the platform to generate conversations, not just here, but with partners from elsewhere. And so the sustainability that we want to implement is partly working with local partners, such as the Walled City Authority and others, but also with partners around the world, right? So we're already in conversation with different biennales and other exhibition projects that are taking place about co-commissions and partnerships, as well as with other art spaces and organizations to kind of think about ways to create a kind of long-term engagement, which isn't just about something that will take place in February and then disappear, but something that will be a resource for all of you in the years to come, right? And so that kind of sustainability is not just for the thinking, but it's also about the practice, right? And how we make that happen in a lasting way. And finally, I want to kind of introduce another term, which is, in addition to sustainability, which is agency. Right? Because I think, I showed you that picture of the Sindh Valley, to start, because in some ways that has been an incredibly disempowering image and representation of Pakistan. It's not a false one, right, in terms of what has happened, but it's also become a kind of a stereotype. Pakistan is this place which is, the victim of global warming, but has no power on its own to do anything about it. And I think that that's something which needs also to be countered and worked against, right? And I think that it may seem like it's a little bit of a stretch to think that art is the site of an agency, of giving people agency, but I'd like to take you through a few examples where I think that that can happen and the ways that it can happen, right? So one of them is an exhibition in which the organization that I belong to, Asia Art Archive, participated in the past 2022, and it's Documenta 15, which, in the genre of recurring exhibitions such as biennales, is one of the best known and one of the best attended, right? It's started in the 1950s at the end of World War II, really kind of addressing local conditions to Germany. It was meant to rebuild, Germany after the catastrophe of war, right? And it has grown to become a kind of a showcase for European and American culture. But not until the past year was the curator for that someone from outside Euro-America. And it was the Indonesian collective Rangrupa who were named as the curators. And what they did was they brought in hundreds, if not thousands, of collaborators from across the global south, right, to work with them on the project. And what Asia Art Archive did was we contributed an exhibition called Translations Expansions, which introduced 3 different case studies for artists serving as not just makers of objects, but also as people who are about the sharing of knowledge and about the preservation of tradition, or the thinking about what is alive in tradition and what can be kept, right, in everyday and vernacular cultures. And so, the examples we chose were the Baroda School, which had the fine arts fair that worked with vernacular cultures in terms of making things like the toys that you see at the bottom. Womanifesto, which is a feminist collective that is based in Thailand that worked with rural communities and artists from around the world to create what today could be called social practice, but at the time they weren't thinking of it that way, right? And then also performance artists across Southeast Asia who were working in ways that really were about building a community despite the challenges of sometimes repressive regimes and generating a new form of culture, right? But it wasn't just what was on view, it was also about bringing people to that, right? And creating new conversations, right? And so part of this, and you can see here people, engaging with the work, and then also this mural that was created by the Good School Collective, which is related to Gwangbukpa, which really is about the emphasis of these kinds of values, about collectivity, about sharing, about the ecosystem, right? As you can see from the friend thinking, right? So these are values that they tried to instill through the system that they created, the Lungbun system, which was about resource sharing, right? A Lungbun is a rice barn where the community stores rice for times of need and it's shared with communally, right? So that's the kind of value that was implemented at Documenta, right? And I also wanted to share with you another kind of project that I worked on called Modern Art Histories in and Across Africa, South and Southeast Asia, which was a collaboration with the Dhaka Art Summit and Cornell University's Institute for Comparative Modernities. And what you're seeing here is this was our gathering in 2020 at the Dhaka Art Summit. So right in the midst of the pandemic as it was happening. And it brought scholars from Africa, from different parts of Asia, from around the world for a convening and a discussion about what was urgent in different regions, but also about the way that those connected to the histories of those regions, right? And it was marvelous because it wasn't just working with big names or established scholars, but really bringing emerging voices, right, the younger scholars to the table so that they could share with us their knowledge. And it's not just learning from the elders, it's also learning from people who are going to be the future, right? And so that was something that was very instrumental and also instructive for me as an experience. And another experience that I think was very empowering was Asia Forum, which is a project that took place in person for the first time, well, has been taking place since 2021 during the pandemic, in the middle of the pandemic. It was about bringing people together to talk about how could Asia be a place not for thinking about regional studies. In other words, like, oh, Asia is like this or Asia is like that, but thinking about how Asia can be a perspective for thinking about global issues, right? And what voices we can bring to that conversation. And in 2022, we had an in-person gathering during the Venice Biennale. And that was something that I think was unique and was the first time we had done that. So that was also part of I think the thinking that informs my own. And then finally, I wanted to talk about one project which may seem a bit like a non sequitur, but I think you'll hopefully bear with me, which is Women Make Art History, which was the first commission of the American collective, the Guerrilla Girls, in Asia, right? And this took place at Asia Art Archive in 2018 when we did a project during Art Basel thinking about gender. And what the Guerrilla Girls did was they contributed a project that was about interrogating the gender imbalance of the host itself. So this took place at Art Basel, right? And so they had this graphic with the famous gorilla mask, with this kind of zombie eyes. And then statistics, like demonstrating what was happening at Art Basel itself, right? And what was interesting about this was that, normally we think about, art as just representation. But this representation really stung, right? Because we also did, statistics of the local institutions, like even ourselves, AA, we realized we only had 3% of our archives were for women artists. So, we've been working on that. The other institutions like museums like M+, also worked on it. And now, every time you go to Art Basel, it's all about women artists, right? So it's not just about representation, it's also implemented long-term change. Right? And I think that that's something that has been incredibly interesting to see, about the way that it enabled certain kinds of actions, right? And here you can see the Gorilla Girls during the event. And I should note that one member of the Gorilla Girls is Zubaydah Aga, not the original Zubaydah Aga, right? But Zubaydah Aga is actually a Pakistani, diasporic Pakistani, right? Who very purposely chose that name, right? And was part of the gathering in Hong Kong. And I think that, it was great for us as an organization, but I think it really generated long-term conversations, because to this day in Hong Kong you can see these conversations and the after effects they're having, right? And that was partly because of the way that the project itself could mobilize an audience, and you can see them here, the audience for Gorilla Girls during their visit to Hong Kong University, very much like an audience like here, right? And so what I think this Biennale is seeking to do is to really not just bring artists and show you what they can do, but also give all of you space to show us what you can do. And so I think that, I'm looking forward to working with all of you and working with the LBF team.